One of the things that needs to be made clear is that Israel has a complete right to protect itself against the importation of arms, and that context is the context that needs to be made clear. Israel has a responsibility to protect its citizens, and Australia recognises that responsibility. Israel is entitled to create a blockade and entitled to maintain a blockade to prevent the flow of weapons. I have no doubt that Israel was legally and morally correct in seeking to prevent the flotilla from reaching Gaza. The challenge is to make sure that that message gets across to the world, and for us here in Australia, gets across to our fellow Australian citizens so that they can begin to understand the context in which that occurred.
I've listened carefully to what my friend Mark Dreyfus has said, and I agree with him that we should always aim to achieve bipartisan support for Israel. However, the Jewish community, both in Australia and beyond, has got to judge for itself the decisions and the actions of our governments and our leaders and make its own decision, make its own judgment as to whether that support is strong enough, whether it's unequivocal enough, whether it sends the right messages. Now, let me just say this. Israel's action in intercepting that flotilla was about sovereignty and national security. Israel has the right, but above all the duty, to protect the safety of its citizens. That is the fundamental duty of every state, of every government, everywhere in the world, at any time in human history. We know, and I've had personal experience, that some of these Islamist NGOs or relief organisations are fronts for nastier, more evil purposes. And I have confronted them several times in the field. Even in Somalia, our Australian troops were fired on several times by the so-called Islamic Relief Organisation, and one of my soldiers was shot through the shoulder, and we're of course engaged in full contact and combat with the Islamic Relief Organisation. And they've been involved in places like Bosnia as well as fronts for activities, and that includes the IHH, which were the Turkish Islamist organisation involved in the Marmara, who have been well recorded through various intelligence agencies, and including the Turkish authorities, as having been involved in support for terrorist organisations, probably most recently involved in support for the attempted bombing in Los Angeles airport. So this is a front organisation for terrorism. We should acknowledge that. We should continue to make sure that the public understands this.
You have not heard one word, no one here has heard a word from the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Minister, from any minister in the Australian government, and nor will you, of criticism of the targeted killing of the Hamas operative. And that is because the Australian government believes that Israel is required in its security interests to undertake that kind of action from time to time. And perhaps I could add to that, Australian troops serving now in Afghanistan are involved in just the same kind of action in the combat against the Taliban, except that generally speaking the killings are carried out by the American forces. So do not confuse the two. One is the protection of Australia's security interests, and the other is the targeted killing, of which the Australian government has expressed no criticism whatsoever.